Seville, a Spanish galleon unloads 3 tons of Aztec gold at the port. The crowd erupts in euphoria. King Charles V smiles. Spain had just become the richest empire in history, but nobody realized that gold was poison. In 80 years, Spain would go from owning half the world to bankrupt. 3 times. It wasn't wars. It wasn't bad luck. It was debt. And the illusion that infinite wealth solves everything. And today, the United States is making the same mistake, with printed dollars instead of stolen gold. Before we continue, check if you're already subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. I love knowing how far these stories reach. The empire where the sun never set, 16th century. Spain wasn't just powerful, it was absurdly dominant. It controlled territories spanning from the Philippines to Mexico, from Peru to the Netherlands, from Naples to Manila. An empire so vast that there was literally always sunlight in some Spanish territory. It was the most extensive empire the world had seen until then, and the secret, gold, silver, tons and tons of them. Let's look at the numbers, because they're shocking. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain extracted more than 180 tons of pure gold from the Americas. But that was nothing compared to silver, more than 16,000 tons. To give you an idea, this represented 80% of all the world's silver at the time. The center of this operation was Potosi, in present-day Bolivia, a mountain literally made of silver. At its peak, Potosi had 200,000 inhabitants, larger than London or Paris at the time. It was the richest city on the planet. They said that with all the silver extracted from there, you could build a bridge of pure silver all the way to Madrid. And it wasn't an exaggeration. The Spanish currency, the Real de Ocho, circulated on every continent. It was accepted in China, India, Africa, the Americas. It was the dollar of that era, the global reserve currency. Spanish kings had an annual revenue greater than all other European monarchs combined. Charles V and later his son Philip II ruled an empire that represented a quarter of the world economy. Madrid was the center of global power. The palaces were covered in gold, the churches in silver. Spanish nobility wore Oriental silks and South American jewels. The Spanish army was the most feared in Europe. The Spanish navy, the famous Invincible Armada, dominated the oceans. No country dared challenge Spain directly. It was the apex of power, the peak of glory. An empire so rich it seemed impossible to fall, but behind all this magnificence, something deadly was growing in silence, something nobody saw, because everyone was hypnotized by the gleam of gold. Spain wasn't building real wealth, it was just transporting precious metal. And there's a brutal difference between these two things, a difference that would cost everything. The day gold turned to dust, a year that marked the beginning of the end. The mines of Potosi begin to dry up. Silver production drops by half in 2 decades. The flow that sustained the empire diminishes, and suddenly Spain looks within its borders and realizes a terrible truth. It has nothing left, no industry, no strong agriculture, no real commerce, just debts, immense debts, unpayable debts. And when the money runs out, everything collapses very quickly. Spanish soldiers in Flanders go 6, 7, 8 months without receiving pay. They begin looting villages, even allied villages. In 1576, the Spanish tercios, considered the best soldiers in Europe, sack Antwerp. 3 days of pure violence, 8,000 dead. A massacre so brutal it became known as the Spanish Fury. And it wasn't out of cruelty. It was out of desperation. Soldiers without pay are mercenaries without control. In Madrid, the situation was equally bleak. The people starved while the royal palaces gleamed in gold. Anger grew. Revolts began. 1640. Catalonia, rebels. Can't bear the abusive taxes anymore to finance distant wars. 1640. Portugal separates. After 60 years under Spanish rule, declares independence. 1647. Naples explodes in popular revolution, massacre of Spanish nobles in the streets. The empire was falling apart, and the currency, the famous currency that circulated worldwide, began to be adulterated. The Spanish kings, desperate, minted copper coins covered with a thin layer of silver. They called it velón. It was official monetary fraud. Merchants quickly noticed. They began refusing payments in Spanish currency. They wanted pure gold or nothing. Trust evaporated, and when trust disappears, money becomes paper, or worthless metal. The Invincible Armada, which once had 130 warships, was reduced to wrecks rotting in ports. No money for maintenance, no money for crew. The ships crossing the Atlantic were increasingly attacked by English, Dutch, French pirates, and Spain couldn't defend its own routes. Trade with the Americas plummeted. In 1700, when Charles II, the last Habsburg king, died without heirs, Spain was a shadow, a poor, indebted, broken shadow, from global empire, owner of half the world, to peripheral country, irrelevant on the European stage. All in 150 years, one generation saw the peak. 3 generations later, they saw the ruin. And the most tragic part? Nobody learned the lesson. And today, we're making exactly the same mistake. You must be thinking, but that was 400 years ago, the world has changed. Has it changed? Or did we just swap colonial gold for printed dollars? Let's look at the parallels, and they're frightening. First parallel, wealth without production. Spain had gold but didn't produce. The United States has the ability to print dollars, but increasingly produces less domestically. Most products consumed in the US come from China, Mexico, Asia. The American industrial base has shrunk dramatically since the 1970s. Detroit, once the industrial heart of the country, is a ghost town. Closed factories, lost jobs. But the dollar remains strong, for now. Why? Because it's the global reserve currency, exactly like the real Dia Ocho was in the 16th century. Second parallel, structural inflation. Spain in the 16th century, 300% inflation in 50 years due to excess precious metal. USA today, rising inflation from uncontrolled money printing. Since 2020, the Federal Reserve has printed more dollars than in all the country's previous history. Trillions injected into the economy. The result? Inflation of 7%, 8%, 9% per year, the highest in 40 years. Prices of food, fuel, housing skyrocketed. The purchasing power of the average American worker fell. They earn more dollars, that buy less. Exactly like the Spaniards in 1580. Third parallel, unpayable debt. Spain in 1600, 200% debt to GDP ratio, went bankrupt 7 times. USA today, 130% federal debt to GDP ratio, more than $34 trillion, and growing $1 trillion every 100 days. Every 100 days. Just the interest on this debt now costs over $1 trillion per year, more than the defense budget. And how do they pay? By printing more money, taking more loans, exactly the Spanish vicious cycle. Fourth parallel, endless wars. Spain spent fortunes on wars in the Netherlands, Italy, England, the Mediterranean. 80 years of war in the Netherlands. 80. The USA? 20 years in Afghanistan. Wars in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen. More than 800 billion spent annually on defense. More than the next 10 countries combined. Military bases in more than 80 countries. Exactly like Spain tried to maintain garrisons in all territories. And the cost? Unsustainable. Fifth parallel, loss of confidence in the currency. In the 17th century, European merchants began refusing the real Dia Ocho. They preferred pure gold or other currencies. Today, China and Russia trade oil in yuan and rubles. Brazil and Argentina close trade deals in local currencies. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, openly discuss creating a common currency to avoid the dollar. Saudi Arabia, a historic US ally, accepts Chinese yuan for oil. This was unthinkable 10 years ago. Dollar hegemony is being questioned, slowly, silently, like what happened with the real Dia Ocho. Sixth parallel, the illusion of being too big to fail. Philip II thought it impossible for Spain to go bankrupt. It was the largest empire on earth. It went bankrupt. Charles V thought gold was infinite. It ran out. Spanish kings believed Potosi's silver would last forever. It dried up. And today, the US thinks the dollar will always be the global currency, that they can print indefinitely without consequences. That debt doesn't matter because everyone needs dollars. But history shows this arrogance always ends the same way, in collapse. Because in the end, deep down in essence, when you print wealth instead of creating it, when you spend more than you produce, when you confuse printed paper with real value, the result is always the same. And today, we're repeating the same story. Only the names of the currencies have changed, and the empires. Spain took 150 years to completely collapse. But the world today is much faster. Information travels instantly, capital moves in seconds, trust can evaporate overnight. What took centuries before, it might take decades now, or less. The lesson history scream, but nobody listens. Spain didn't fall because the gold ran out. It fell because it never understood what real wealth was. It thought shiny metal was power, that importing everything and producing nothing would work forever. That debt had no consequences when you were the largest empire in the world. It was wrong, completely wrong, and it paid the highest price an empire can pay: irrelevance. From global power to historical footnote, from ruler of the seas to peripheral country. And the tragedy wasn't the fall itself. The tragedy was that it was avoidable, totally avoidable, if they had invested in industry instead of wars, if they had created a real economy instead of just transporting gold, if they had understood that wealth comes from work, creation, production, not from extraction, not from printing, not from illusion. But they didn't. Because it's hard to resist the temptation of easy money. It's hard to choose to build when you can simply spend. It's hard to be disciplined when you're the richest in the world. And today, the United States is at the same crossroads. They can choose the path of fiscal discipline, real production, sustainable economy, or they can continue printing, spending, accumulating debts, thinking they're too big to fail, like Spain thought, like Rome thought, like all empires thought. Until the day they fell. And when they fall fast. Because empires don't fall gradually in gentle decline. They seem invincible until the moment they crumble, and then it's too late. Spain had 150 years of signs, 7 bankruptcies, 7 screaming warnings. It ignored them all. The US is receiving the signs now: rising inflation, explosive debt, loss of manufacturing, declining confidence in the dollar. Will it listen? History suggests no. Because those in power never think the fall will happen on their watch. They always think this time is different, but it never is. Names change, technologies change, clothes change, but human nature, arrogance, greed, those never change. And that's why history repeats itself, not identically, but in patterns, in cycles, in lessons nobody learns until it's too late. Spain had mountains of silver and died of hunger. The US has money printers and can die the same way. Because in the end, deep down, at the most basic essence of economics, when money stops representing real value, when currency loses trust, when the empire forgets that wealth is created, not printed, collapse is inevitable. The only question is when, and the answer, if history serves as a guide, is always the same: sooner than you think. And the next empire in our series shows how the greatest naval power in history, the British Empire, entered silent collapse because of a hidden debt nobody saw, a debt that wasn't in the books, but that corroded the empire from within. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss it, because if there's one thing history teaches, it's that it doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And the verse is closing, the pattern is returning, and this time, it's coming back fast.